So I'm with Dr. Mike Levin today. He's an associate professor of psychology at Utah State University. He's also the co-director of the Utah State University Acceptance and Commitment Therapy Research Group. He earned his Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the University of Reno, Nevada, Reno. Studied under Steve Hayes, who helped develop acceptance and commitment therapy. And Mike has been busy. So he's published over 100 articles, book chapters, primarily on ACT, and a lot of his research focuses on online self-directed ACT programs. And he's also published 3 books on ACT and addictive behaviors. So I'm excited to learn more from Mike. So thanks for joining us.
Great. Yeah, thank you for having me, and excited to talk about this work and how it could be helpful for people who are struggling with addiction issues or really any kind of broad issues and wanting to improve their lives.
Wonderful. So I like stories, so I want to hear your story, like how you first got introduced to ACT, kind of what was your journey learning it, kind of as a student, but then as a researcher, practitioner. What's been your ACT evolution over the years?
Yeah, I still remember when I was in undergrad, I've always been really interested in mindfulness. I grew up in a hippie household and was really into martial arts when I lived in Hawaii. And so I was interested in mindfulness. And I remember there was this moment I was at a talk with, it was actually a very famous psychologist, David Barlow, and he was talking about how these ideas of mindfulness could be applied to people at the time working with anxiety problems. And I literally had this like aha moment, like mind blowing, like, wait a second, like psychology can be about that? Like this thing that I've really valued. I found it so helpful in my own personal development and personal struggles, this capacity to just slow down, be mindful of the present, accept what's there, that like, wow, we could actually do this in psychology. This is awesome. And it was in the early 2000s when that work had been happening for a while, but it wasn't as well known. It hadn't really like exploded in terms of public availability, in terms of the research. And so I ended up applying to the few labs that were doing mindfulness research at the time, and started working with Steve Hayes, who's the primary developer of ACT. And one of the really interesting things I explored and learned was that, so I've been very interested in this ability to use mindfulness to make room for whatever difficult experiences are there, to not get so stuck in our thoughts and to be able to see them as thoughts, and how that ability to then really notice the present moment for what it was afforded a lot of opportunities. One of the things that was really interesting though in learning about ACT was there's this other piece to it, which has to do with identifying and clarifying what really matters to you and taking steps to move towards those things. And one of the things I thought was really interesting, talking about my own personal experience, was I hadn't really done a lot of that work and I hadn't really oriented to that piece. And I found it really fascinating in graduate school as I explored, like, what do I want to be about? Like, I focus more on getting unstuck and less on what I want to move towards.
Yeah.
And appreciating how when you get unstuck, that the journey's not done. Like, you also need to be thinking about, like, what do you want to be moving towards in your life? And really, I found a lot of value of that in ACT. So I became an ACT convert, so to speak. And I was convinced I really liked this approach that we need both. We need to figure out ways to step out of unnecessary psychological suffering that naturally just happens because of how our minds work, of how we've evolved as humans. So we need skills to get unstuck, like mindfulness, but we really need that other piece too of using our brain to figure out what we want to be moving towards and really take meaningful, purposeful steps towards those things. And so from there I was hooked and got excited about the research side and digging into it more, and especially self-help, which I know we'll talk about more, and how we can use technology like the internet to increase people's access to these skills, and in part kind of a self-reflection of, gosh, I wish I knew these things earlier. I was into mindfulness, but I didn't know this values part, partly seeing family members and friends really suffer with their own psychological struggles, and then quickly realizing, gosh, there's therapists out there, and that's a great resource, but we need other ways to reach people. Some of my family members not being willing to seek help, some not getting the best evidence-based care I think is available. And so I got very passionate about how we can make web-based technologies and other types of services that people can access on their own as an additional resource they can use.
That's incredible to hear that journey, and to hear that your roots were in that mindfulness, and to think about like, wow, this could be part of improving mental health. And for me, when I first heard about ACT, I was in a very behavioral clinical psychology program that was so focused on symptom reduction and exposure therapy, where I learned it's like, wait, like it creates more space to accept these internal feelings. I'm like, this is not what we do. And then that thought of like, pursue your values. It's like, whoa, that has been missing from mental health for a long time. So it was really exciting. Like you mentioned, it does increase your options about what you can do. But then like getting unstuck is only half of it. You still need to focus on building that life in that next step.
Yeah, absolutely, and I really appreciate you bringing that in, like that piece too of like I just think in our cultures in general, we're often presented with this model of we've got to change our thoughts and feelings, and that's how we are able to make meaningful changes. And I really love that piece of mindfulness and acceptance work, the self-compassion it brings. Like it's okay to think and feel what you do. It makes sense. That's just part of you, but it doesn't have to control what you do. And so, yeah, I agree. It's a really cool shift,
Yep.
which I get excited about because then I sometimes say it's like, I, it's fine if all this research leads to the same things your grandma would have told you to do, but I think really nice when it says, hey, here's something totally different that we know from science can help you make meaningful changes. And I think that this is a nice example where it coheres well with some old
Yeah.
traditions, but with some new strategies.
Yeah, it all comes together. And I remember the first time I learned ACT, I was in graduate school, and Mike Tuig, your colleague, came up to Idaho State and did a full day ACT training. I was so excited to learn about it because there had been a lot of research. And I left that day thinking, like, what was that? Like, that is not what I had imagined would be like this treatment. And how is it to have to be so applicable for so many mental health concerns, from OCD to depression to anxiety to trauma? And it felt so different. And I like what you said, you became kind of a convert over time. And that was true for me, where initially I kind of put it down and it's like, no, this isn't what my mind thinks would be effective. And yet, as
Mm-hmm.
I continue to work with people and evolve, I recognize like, there's a huge role for mindfulness and getting more comfortable with thoughts and emotions that we may not enjoy. And then instead of just exposing people to things that make them anxiety provoking, I'm really helping them focus on building their life. Like I found that shift to be so meaningful, but it took me a little while to make that transition.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's true for people, like for clients too. Like, we talk about this a lot in our research and, setting up protocols and just really thinking about this idea of like, we're trying to introduce this very radically different way of approaching your inner world that's different from probably a lot of the things you've been trying to do to cope with these things, what you've been told how to cope with these things. And so it's a really big shift, but that's part of I think what's exciting about it because then it's really doing something new, and I think that's key in our role is helping people break out of old habits and try something new that'll help them get unstuck.
I love it. And I'm hearing some of your values in there, that you really care about bringing these principles to people on a larger scale. And so the first time I met you, I was at Utah State, their counseling center, and you were doing some trials on kind of a app-based, web-based structure for acceptance and commitment therapy that you've now developed into the ACT guide. And that was one of the first times I thought like, wow, like people could get benefit just from guiding themselves through these principles. That could be really low cost and accessible and extremely
Mm-hmm.
helpful. And you've done just a ton of research in that area. Tell us about what you've discovered, some of the things you've done, and how these principles could be helpful even when it's self-directed.
Yeah, yeah, it's such it's a really interesting issue, and I think especially relevant right now with people's limited ability to leave their house and access different care. But I think that one of the things that's really jumped out to me is that there's decades and decades of research at this point, that we have a lot of psychological skills that we know can improve people's lives and address specific problems. And yet many people who suffer with these problems don't end up learning those skills. And there's a variety of different problems with it. Some of it has to do with the supply side, like having enough practitioners trained in those methods, and in the places that people are. So especially when I think of more rural locations, people don't necessarily have access to specialized skills, even though for decades we've known that we have these skills that can help people. I think there's also challenges on the consumer side, on people who are struggling, and seeing my own friends and family go through this. There's things like stigma. It's hard to accept that we have these mental health problems because society's added a lot of stigma to that. Even though I think it makes sense when we get stuck in depression. It makes sense when we get stuck in addiction. Like, it truly does. Like, we're hardwired to get stuck in some of these loops. And so, but we have these stigmatizing labels added. So sometimes that gets in the way for people. Just again, the costs, the ability to access it when you're in rural locations, those can get in the way. And so with those different challenges, I've gotten, it really does resonate with my values. Like, gosh, we have this stuff that's really helpful and it's not getting to people. And how do we get it out to people in different formats? I always recommend therapy first and foremost. I think it's really an excellent way to learn these skills. And it offers a lot you don't get in self-guided resources. Having someone really talk through it with you, give you their expert, feedback on what you're struggling with and assessing it in a detailed way. But when people aren't able to access it, or they're not sure if they're ready to do that, I really get passionate about how we can use these self-guided resources to teach these skills that, again, we've known for decades at this point can improve these problems. So I guess maybe that's starting with just the broad context, but that's kind of like where I get a lot of this passion and wanting to focus on it.
That's awesome. Because I'm someone I'm sold on the relationship in therapy, that having someone that you can interact with that is safe, can validate your experiences and give you some perspective. That's not going to go away. We're going to need that. And we can still get benefit from walking yourself through the principles. And I've thought about that for myself. Like, I've learned a lot of different therapy approaches, from client-centered to dialectical behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. And I use those concepts on myself, like, all the time, that I'm observing my thoughts and sometimes challenging them, other times being mindful. And I thought, like, I've benefited just from learning about these concepts in my own life. And it makes sense that people would benefit from learning about them too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so with that idea of, things we started to find, one thing I'd say is that, and this is speaking kind of broadly, but over about the past 15 years or so, there's been this really growing large body of research on figuring out this very idea. Can we learn these skills on our own through things like websites, and more recently mobile apps? And the research, I think, is very clear that we can. And I don't say just speaking to my program of research or a few studies. This is really speaking to hundreds and hundreds of clinical trials done across the world with pretty much every specific problem we can name. That time and time again, we do find that we can learn these skills. Interestingly, some of the summative research, kind of bringing it all together, suggests it's even as effective as working with a therapist. I always question that, but the reason I point it out is just to say it highlights that it's pretty effective. Like this is pretty good. It's not like, oh, it helps, but just a little bit. Like, it seems pretty useful. Again, I still think working with a therapist it has a lot of added benefit. But the research does suggest, like, okay, you can learn these skills on your own, and it is pretty useful for people. So some of the things that we've looked at is, there's a lot of this research broadly, but not as much of it with ACT, and being interested in this combination of learning skills to get unstuck and learning skills to move towards what matters to you. We want to look at how can we do this in an online format there? And it's not necessarily a given, because ACT is very experiential. It's very different than the normative way we think about thoughts and feelings and how to solve problems related. So we weren't sure, like, really how that'd pan out. But we've seen in our own studies, in over 20 clinical trials now, that it does look effective. That, again, we can, just like in this broader literature, we really can learn these skills in a self-guided format and it improve a variety of different mental health problems. So speaking at still kind of like the broad level, it does suggest that these programs can be useful for people.
And that is shocking to me. So like to hear you say that you've seen like almost equivalent findings to in-person therapy, my therapist mind's like, no, that can't be. Like, how could somebody learn these concepts on their own? And like that's encouraging, where it's like, that's amazing. But can you talk to us a little bit more about how you could get even close to equivalent outcomes on your own as with working with a professional? That to me is incredible.
Yeah, and the way I like to think of it is more a question, it's kind of a methods issue in part. It's easier to say that two things are the same than that they're different. So I think that I still think that therapy is more effective, most likely. And really the only way to answer if they truly are the same would be to have a lot more, much more carefully controlled research.
Okay.
Because basically the default in research is to assume things are the same.
Yeah.
But that said, given there's been a decent number of studies looking at this and they're suggesting the same, it means it's at least pretty good. Like, okay, this isn't like doing so much worse than therapy that like, I don't know if I can recommend it. It's doing pretty good. So I think it's partly a method issue. Again, the default being things are the same, and really then the burden is on showing there's a difference, and there hasn't been enough studies to answer that question definitively. But I don't think it's the right question ultimately, in that like what we really know is that different things work better for different people. I'll give a few examples. So one has to do with access, that some people really want to work with someone and they're not really interested in learning these skills on their own. So it's a preference issue. Like, okay, like that's fine. There's a website, but I want to learn this talking with someone. That makes sense to me. So, and then there's some people we find in one survey we did with college students, about 17% who don't want to work with a therapist, but would be willing to use self-help. So some of it's just like different things are going to be better for different people. One thing that's a really big issue, and I encourage people to think about it if they use self-guided resources, is that it's harder to stick with it when you don't have a person involved. And we know that from a lot of different types of research. And so what is missing in the stuff I've talked about so far is that we see anywhere from about 20% to maybe as high as about 60% of people drop out of these programs before they've done enough for us to think, yeah, they've really learned the skills. And so what that means is you want to be mindful if you're using those skills to stick with it. Like, you know, you probably have books on your shelf you've never read. You probably have websites on your bookmark that you've never gone to. And like, just be mindful like of that human tendency and think about, you know, what have you how have you approached tasks in the past that you're like doing on your own, and like how can you do this successfully? And for some people, I think it's, you know, ultimately it's better to work with a therapist, or at least do it adjunctively, work with therapists and use a self-help resource. So anyway, that's a few of the factors. There's other ones to talk about, but some of it just has to do with preference and will people be able to stick to these resources on their own?
And that makes a lot of sense to me, because I'm someone that if I'm struggling with something, I'm probably going to do some research independently initially, and then reach out to somebody and talk about it. Other people, they're going to go to people. They need that support. But that follow through is key. And I think that's one advantage of therapy, is you're meeting with somebody consistently. That may be on a weekly basis or every other week. And that kind of keeps it on your mind. And that is more challenging to do when you're kind of doing it on your own. So I appreciate you speaking to that these programs may be helpful, and yet one of the challenges is people may be more likely to kind of drop out along the way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, you know, it's just being aware of pros and cons. And, you know, as people are looking at using these resources, keep that in mind. Like, how am I going to stick with it?
Yep.
As a therapist, we do that too. Like, you know, we'll talk about how are we going to, like, what's our commitment to therapy? How are we sticking with it? What's the structure? So it's almost like doing some of that for yourself if you're going to use a self-guided resource.
That's great. So you also mentioned like how versatile ACT is, and you said something that it is a shift in the way we think about mental health, that we're kind of programmed to get stuck in these traps. And kind of going through undergrad in psychology, I always thought there was a distinction between kind of normal behaviors and then these abnormal behaviors, and that it would be scary if I had a diagnosis of something. And then the more I've gotten to know myself and other people, that distinction between normal and abnormal doesn't exist. That's more of a product of language. And that we all struggle with different types of things, and those struggles are on a continuum, and that sometimes believing there is normal might actually cause more suffering. And I think
Mhm.
that's one of the benefits of ACT and why it's helpful for so many presenting concerns, is it's really targeting some really core issues that are universal, that all of us experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of really interesting things to explore in that area. One thing that comes to mind for me, and I think it's been more relevant with the pandemic, in terms of people having a variety of emotional experiences, trying to figure out like what's normal, is like, thinking of our emotions as in part like they serve a purpose. They've evolved to have a function. And one thing they do is they kind of tell us when things in our environment aren't quite right. And so, like, when I feel sad, so some of that's like I lost something important to me. And there's actually a useful function to take a beat, right? Like, if you lost something important to you, that's not the time to go run around and be happy and do a lot of stuff. Like if we feel sad during the pandemic, it's leads the urge to withdraw a bit, not interact with people. And actually that's a good thing. Like you can literally see the evolved function of sadness happening right now, right? Like pull back, make sure it's safe before you engage. Where I think people get stuck is, and this is also a natural result of how human language works and how we've evolved to function. But where we get stuck is the problem shifts from what's happening in the outer world, like there's a pandemic, it makes sense to be sad, or it makes sense to be anxious, and it shifts to the problem being internal. The problem is I'm sad, and that's the issue. And when we shift from it being a response to the outer world to being it that something inside of us is wrong, I think then we start to get off track because, okay, there's danger in the outer world. Let's assess the danger. Let's figure out what to do. Okay, that makes, but when it's like, okay, the danger is about me internally, that's where we get a little stuck. One way to frame it maybe is like, it's like a smoke alarm. And sure, your smoke alarm goes off at unhelpful times sometimes. And sometimes it goes off during a fire, like, you have a grease fire or you left something in the oven and it's burning. Not that I've ever done that. And so then it's like the problem is we're like trying to shut off the smoke alarm and we're missing there's a fire, right? And like and we need to get, I think part of what ACT is teaching is people be a little more flexible. Like, okay, there's a smoke alarm happening. First of all, the smoke alarm's not going to hurt me. I'm just going to notice it and then decide what to do. Like, is this a time to put out a fire? Is this a time that like just acknowledge that I'm having a smoke alarm go off, and sometimes it goes off at the wrong time, and that's okay. But having that kind of perspective on things, the problem isn't the smoke alarm.
Yeah, I love that analogy, because I think it's scary when that alarm goes off and our mind's like, there's danger everywhere. And sometimes there really is danger. And other times it's like, oh yeah, things are okay. But that alarm is just information that those emotions are helpful for you to kind of take stock. But I think you're right. People get really distressed. I think we've been taught that feeling sad or feeling lonely or anxious or depressed is bad. It's abnormal. It's broken. We need to fix it. We need to get rid of it. And that seems
Mm-hmm.
to compound it and make the alarms go off even more.
Yeah. Yeah. Like if you ever had a smoke alarm beeping and you're like, I can't handle this thing. And for whatever reason, you haven't changed the battery. It's like it gets more and more annoying and frustrating and bigger. Yeah. And again, it's just like, we don't want to throw away our smoke alarm. Like we buy smoke alarms for a reason. We have them installed. They help keep us safe. They have a purpose. Yeah. So finding a different way to relate to that.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, our mind is not our enemy. Like, it's just understanding its function. And that's what I appreciate about ACT. I feel like it's helped me understand how my mind works better. And so I'm not struggling with it or arguing with it or disagreeing it. I'm starting to recognize, like, wow, it has a lot of value and it's really good at certain types of problems. And other situations it's not as good at. And yet I'm really grateful that I got a good mind that is going to try to be there for me and sound the alarms. And it's okay if there's some false alarms. Like, I appreciate the times where there are true danger and it's alerting me to that. So we don't want to get rid of that system. It is really adaptive and functional, but it is helpful to kind of get the playbook for it, to understand how it's working. And when you kind of have that playbook, it doesn't seem as scary or distressing or troubling.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Mike, you've done a lot of work with addictive behaviors and pornography. How did you get involved in kind of that subset of kind of human struggles?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a few thoughts about it. One is so part of the context we're talking about is I've always been interested in the breadth of ACT, that like that we could teach these skills that could be widely helpful for a range of different problems people have. And this started even when I was interested in mindfulness. From the get-go, part of what made me excited about mindfulness is that it's not so much the thought or feeling you're struggling with, it's how you're struggling with it. And that mindfulness can help you shift out of that focus. And if we had a skill that could really help people with a variety of struggles, like ways that could serve people that aren't getting the best tools right now, like, and one that jumps out to me is addictive behaviors. Like, for example, I've done work with substance abuse and people who really struggle with, let's say, alcohol, for example. One of the things I notice time and time again as a psychologist is that, like, certainly there's some things about the substance specifically,
Yep.
but there's also always a lot of psychological suffering, like drinking a lot every day wasn't happening in a bubble. It wasn't just because they enjoyed drinking. It was that there was a lot of suffering. There was a lot missing in life. And over time, as people got more stuck in drinking, life got more challenging and more difficult. And what I really like about ACT is helping people who are struggling with these addictive behaviors to also learn these skills to deal with their inner world, because I think that was just such a core problem. And relatedly, help them build a life worth staying sober for, meaning like, okay, what are the things missing in your life and how do we approach those things? Alcohol in some ways is doing something for you. It's allowing you to escape from that difficult feeling. But like, because you've pursued that so much, you've missed out on all these other parts of your world. And how do we start building that out again? Which takes a lot of acceptance, because as life gets more and more challenging, it's harder to build that back up. You're not going to get back to being fully employed in a house, et cetera, when you've had chronic substance use problem with the snap of a finger per se. So it's going to be these incremental steps. And I've been really honored to see the work that people have done, you know, in navigating incredibly hard situations and staying sober. So that's talking about alcohol use specifically, but really just this idea that when people are struggling with addiction, it's kind of like what we were talking about before. The focus often gets really narrowly on the addictive behavior, like let's not drink, or with pornography use, don't use pornography. And it forgets the broad context of it, like, which is probably why people are using pornography ultimately, right? So like, well, what difficult thoughts and feelings are you struggling with that leads to you pornography, even though you don't want to be doing it? And that being an important distinction, it's really when people don't want to be doing it, it's having negative problems in their life. So those are kind of a scattered set of thoughts, but I get very interested in how those issues come up with the addictive behaviors.
Yeah. And what kind of things have you kind of discovered in your work about maybe reasons why people might struggle with something like pornography?
Yeah, so the first study I did was at the time, Michael Tuig, who's a colleague of mine at Utah State University, you mentioned, and we actually came from the same research lab, from Steve Hayes' research lab, who's a primary developer of ACT. So at the time, Mike had published his first trial evaluating ACT for people struggling with pornography addiction issues. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I've been interested in like alcohol. I hadn't really looked at pornography, but again, it's like, it's really looking at the function or what the behavior serves, not so much the form. So I'm like, oh, let's look at that with pornography. But one of the issues that came up pretty early on is, and it's kind of similar in some ways to alcohol. It's like, okay, this is a normative behavior that a variety of people engage in, but some people get stuck with it. And so we got kind of interested in like, who's getting stuck and why? So we did a study looking with college males. And what we found was that similar to what we've been discussing so far, the people who are getting really stuck with pornography use and having problems like depression, anxiety, negative effects from pornography use was really also people who were just struggling in general with managing their inner world, where they were really getting stuck in fighting their thoughts and feelings, which kind of makes sense given what we've been talking about, right? That a variety of people use pornography. and some people find benefits from it. There's been nice research on that, but some people get really stuck, and that it in part has to do with sort of like, what is the function of pornography? Is how are people using it? And if they're really using it to escape and avoid their inner world, and they're getting really locked into that pattern rigidly, like that's like their main way to cope with anxiety and difficult emotions, that seems to be some people who are getting especially stuck with it. So I thought that was interesting in terms of helping kind of clarify like who's getting stuck and why with pornography.
So you found for a lot of people, it was people that were turning to pornography was more in an effort to avoid discomfort. And that could be anxiety or depression, but other things are going on in their life that maybe led them to be more susceptible to struggle with something like pornography.
Yeah, and I think that's an important piece, like other things happening in their life. And that's what I was talking about addictive behaviors in general. It's like, it's like the problems are sort of maybe being made aware by talking about pornography, but again, serving a function, and there's these other challenges that might be arising for people. We did a follow-up study of that, and we found a similar pattern. We looked at like different reasons people use pornography. There's a nice measure. It looks at things like kind of like the just sexual pleasure, learning about sex, and I think curiosity is another one, but there's one that's about using it to kind of like avoid negative feelings, like using it as an emotional coping strategy. And we found that it was specifically that use of pornography that was leading to people getting stuck in their life, which makes sense. Like I would say, if we even just switched it to having sex, it'd be a similar concern, right? Like we probably don't want to be having sex with our partner just because we feel bad. That's probably not the main function you'd want to have, right? Like and if that was the main function, you'd probably miss things, right? Because if it was about building closeness, well, you would do that in the context of closeness with your partner, and you'd build closeness in the activity. If instead you're doing it just because you feel bad, you might be proposing sex when it doesn't make sense. And like you're having a fight with your partner, you're like, hey, let's have sex to cope with this. So the idea being that it's really about the function of using pornography in the same way, right? Like, so if you're using it to get away from thoughts and feelings, it might lead to these rigid, less helpful patterns of pornography use.
And I really appreciate that perspective, because I know whenever you talk about sexuality or pornography, people have really strong opinions. And for me, what I found helpful from an ACT standpoint is I start to view things more as a tool. And tools aren't good or bad, they're just tools. And I think about pornography could be a tool that could be helpful in some ways for people and really quite problematic in other ways. It doesn't make it a bad tool, it just depends on the function. And if it is like, well, this is my tool to get away from all discomfort in my life, it's probably not going to be the most helpful tool over time. Like that might help temporarily for you or occasionally, but it kind of prevents you from cultivating other skills to manage distress and discomfort and creating a vocabulary to share these things with people and pursuing your values in your life, that it really does, like you said, get more rigid and narrow over time, because it's not a very helpful tool for that. But I think people get stuck on that, and because I think there's a moral component to it for a lot of people, where it's like, no, we can't look at it objectively. It's just bad or wrong. I need to get rid of it. And that kind of prevents us from understanding it and creating space to actually work with it.
Yeah. And there's another piece we've been talking around that I think this is a perfect highlight of. Like we were talking about it a little bit when we were talking about like the normal versus abnormal, and like how, well, really, no, it's just like our minds, our emotions are function as they function. But like when we start labeling things as wrong and bad, one of the things that we can start having happen is these feedback loops. So like with anxiety, there's a classic one. This is really how people get stuck with panic, which is that they start feeling panicky, and then they're like, oh no, I can't have a panic attack. That's really bad and dangerous. If you're thinking, oh my gosh, this really bad and dangerous thing's about to happen, you get more panicky, and you get this feedback loop. And this happens with, you can get depressed about depression. It can really happen with any of these things. So with pornography use, if it's like I'm using it to avoid negative emotions, and then but then when I use pornography, it goes against my values, or for other reasons it causes problems for me, then I might feel shameful afterwards, right? Like I get immediate relief, but really right after I get shameful. And then, well, now I feel ashamed, and I'm just doing this feedback loop of continuing engagement in behavior that just feeds more of those negative emotions. It's a rigged game that we get stuck in.
And that's what I've seen over and over, is it just contributes to that shame cycle, because it helps temporarily, but then I feel worse. And this is the strategy I turn to when I'm not feeling good. And it just seems to make that worse over time. And yet our mind's focus is on, well, pornography is the problem. if I get rid of that, then I'm good. And our mind's just not aware of that context, that it's how we're approaching this struggle or how we're interacting with our discomfort. And that's what I appreciate about ACT, is it kind of says, let's hold on here. Let's take a step back and kind of observe what's going on and how our actions may be contributing to this. And that is really different than pornography is doing this. It's more like, how are we playing a role in this? Or how are our thoughts or our own relationship to ourselves? How is that part of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think importantly, it makes sense. Like, again, like our minds have kind of evolved to figure out what the problem is and solve it. But sometimes it's sort of misapplied or it gets stuck in these unhelpful tracks. And a classic one being, yeah, I'm judging this pattern because I'm just feeding this feedback loop with it. So it makes sense we get stuck in that pattern, and we see it in a variety of different areas. But I think the idea is, and we can do something to change it. And these skills can be ways to shift out of it.
Love it. So you've kind of worked with a variety of kind of addictive behaviors, from alcohol use to pornography. And this is a question I get quite a bit, where a lot of people compare pornography to a drug that you can ingest, like alcohol or methamphetamine. So I'd like to hear, based on your kind of experience, how might something like sexual images be similar to something like alcohol, and how might they be different?
Yeah, that's interesting. I have a few thoughts on it, but I'm aware of what I know well and what I don't know well. So, addiction's interesting because it often feels like it's very concrete and objective and clear, but then really quickly we start realizing how fuzzy and socially constructed the terms are. It doesn't mean that they're useless then. Appreciating social construction doesn't mean therefore we throw it out. It just means appreciating, like, we want to be thoughtful about it's not necessarily as true as we think it is with a big capital T. We know everything.
Yeah.
Like with substances, there are some really well-defined biological pathways that can lead to physiological dependence. Alcohol strikes me as one example where in some cases people can become so physiologically dependent they can literally die going through withdrawal symptoms. So there are some unique qualities to it. And I sometimes get stuck there whenever I hear discussions of some other behaviors being equated to the exact same type of addiction. But maybe that's almost like a little bit of a red herring, because okay, we can talk about the details, but also withdrawing from heroin doesn't put you at risk of dying, although you do have a physiological withdrawal. So there's distinctions with all these substances anyway. I think I'd come back to the function. Maybe it's a cop out as a psychologist, but coming back to what purpose does it serve to say viewing these images is like alcohol, is like heroin, is like crack. And what I often do whenever I get to that question would be to consider, well, what's the functions we don't want to have? Because, how something ends up working, it could be very different than your intent. You might be saying, I want to equate the two because I want to raise public awareness and just have people treat this seriously. And okay, that makes sense to me. But then there's some unintended consequences that can happen. So a really big one, and one that I've been interested in for a long time, is how the addiction label can sometimes be quite stigmatizing to people. And so we know this to be a really big issue with substance abuse disorders, that there's a high level of stigma. We hear in our culture, in our communities, a pretty constant dialogue about moral weakness or other issues. How people just don't want to get better, they're criminals, etc. And what ends up happening is that there's all this in the air that affects how people treat individuals with addiction, which is a real shame, and I think leads to a lot of societal issues. But then I think where it gets really toxic, and what I'm trying to point to with this negative function, is people start to internalize those messages, and you start to see these really problematic patterns where, again, like feedback loops, it's like people who are struggling with addiction are now telling themselves, I just can't get better. I don't want to get better. I don't know what's wrong with me. I must be broken, blah, blah, blah. This stream of things they hear. And that really impedes their ability to make meaningful changes. And it just really makes life a lot more miserable, because that's a pretty awful world to live in, to think that about yourself and to feel that's how everyone thinks about you. So my worry is that that's been a big problem in addictions, one that actually found ACT is useful for, to help people step out of that unhelpful narrative. And my worry is that as we bring in, if you bring in any other behavior to that same area, that you might feed that same self-stigmatizing label that like, what's wrong with me? And for example, if you have a slip, okay, I used some pornography and I was committed to not using pornography, and I used pornography. It's like, well, that means that like, see, I can't do it. There's something wrong with me, blah, 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 blah. And like, then you're back to whatever pattern you didn't want to do. And again, I think it just makes life really miserable when you carry around a lot of those self-judgments. So that was a long answer, but that would be one example of a concern I have, is some of these unintended effects.
Yeah. I really appreciate that thoughtful response, because I think that's the question I get the most, and I probably struggle with helping people understand that, because clearly substances you ingest impact us on a biological level, and pretty much everything we do, from what we eat to our physical activity. Sex is a powerful reinforcer, and there's a lot of research that shows that, operates on similar neurological pathways. And it's like, yeah, that makes sense. It's a reinforcer, just like drugs, like dopamine's going to be involved. I'm good with that. But I think what for me is significant is what you said, that the term addiction has an impact. Like, it changes how we see ourselves and our identity and our focus. And that language around addiction can contribute to us being stuck. And I've found that a lot with pornography, that part of it can be more problematic than the physiological impact of viewing sexual images. And that's how powerful our mind and language is and identity. And so, like, I'm okay if people say, like, pornography functions in an addictive quality like substances on a biological level. It's like, yeah, it might do that. And our relationship to that language can be problematic in helping us overcome that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we're talking, one of the other things that comes up to me when you do equate the two is, okay, when you equate the two, essentially what you're doing, even just thinking from a verbal perspective, is you're kind of like saying, so all this stuff we know about addiction applies here. And that's not necessarily the case. So I think it can lead people astray in some ways that we don't know, or that might not be true for them, or might just be inaccurate. Like, one thing I sometimes see in the addiction world is this sense of like, I'm always going to be an addict. And sometimes the rigidity in that can get people stuck. For example, again, it gives a sense of, there's a term for it, prognostic pessimism. We know this broadly in the literature, that one part of the stigma label, especially thinking of it as like a brain disease, can feed this too, is this sense of like, if you think you're always going to be an addict, like, then there's this sense like, I can't get better. So people get stuck there. I don't think that's true of like the use of it in AA, et cetera, but I do think that's a place when misapplied, people can get stuck. Another kind of link is like, sort of like, if it's like heroin, then if I use it once, then I'm going to be dependent or something. And so I think it can sometimes feed these unhelpful stances towards the substance. Like, it's just like crack. So and so if someone has a slip away from their goals, or if they choose to look at it, they're going to think, oh no, now I'm addicted. Because they're going to assume it's just like crack, when it isn't the same thing. So we're kind of misapplying what we know about some of these substances to this other thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably one of my favorite shifts when I'm using ACT principles of somebody that's been viewing pornography on and off for many, many years is they can let go of that label that they're a porn addict. And they can start to kind of put the pen in their hands and write their own story, write their own narrative. And what do you really want your life to be defined by? What do you want your legacy to be? And that can be based on relationships you have, and pursuits, and education, and career, and all these really wonderful things. And we're able to do that when we can let go of that kind of rigid application of, I'm a porn addict. It's like, that doesn't really define us. That might be a behavior that you've engaged in to cope with distress in the past, but really it just kind of opens the doors for who do you want to be and what do you want your life to be about.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And yeah.
So Mike, I'd love to hear from you, because you've done this research. What helpful kind of low-cost self-help books or programs or apps or resources have you come across that you would recommend for folks that are struggling with anxiety or depression or pornography? What have you found that works?
Yeah, one thing I'd want to note is we didn't talk about it yet is, we're talking about this like increased access. There's this really big issue, and it just is an issue. It's getting worked out, but hasn't worked out yet. Of there's a lot out there that's self-help that hasn't been studied. So I do really recommend people be very cautious in the same way, or actually let me add a little more. Be very cautious about what they see, what they access, knowing that it could be anything. And it's a little different. Like if they go to see you, Cameron, for example, like you're a licensed therapist, a psychologist, like, which means that like as at multiple levels in our country and frankly beyond, like we've protected you, the public, to say this person can treat this effectively and is working within their scope, and et cetera. But when we get to self-help, there's not those protections in place.
Like
so
the Wild West.
and people should really be aware of that. Like you're stepping into the Wild West of like, you could get leeches or you could get an MD who's well trained and you just don't know what you're getting. And there's no regulation on what they're saying for the most part. So just being very aware of that and cautious. There are some things that I think have some evidence. I don't know specifically in the pornography use problem self-help, besides your program, Cameron, and I've looked through it, and I also know it's based on a good evidence-based program. So I assume you'll include a link for that. That's the only one specifically for pornography use that I know of.
And how about in general?
Yeah, and then so in general, so a few things, and maybe I can send you links that we can add after. One that I recommend people go to, there's a variety of different groups that are now trying to organize, like, okay, but here is a list of like apps, for example, that we think are good. So Cyber Guide, PSYBER guide.com. That's, I think, our best area in psychology that's collecting a bunch of apps and saying, hey, based on your problem, and we're going to give you careful reviews. They're vetting all the apps. So I really recommend going there to look at what's available. Another source I'd recommend, and I'll send this link also, is the VA has a set of apps they've developed. It's for veterans first and foremost, but they're really broadly applicable, and they've made them available to the public for free. And there's a really nice set of different apps there. There's some of them are a little more outdated, like the ACT app is a little more outdated. There's a COVID-19 app they released. There's a lot of really cool target coping apps that I like. So that's another one I recommend. And again, I'll send a list. CBITS, which is a group at Northwestern, they're, I think, in my opinion, like the leading e-health, m-health researchers. So looking at mobile apps, especially now, but also websites to teach psychological skills. They've got a suite of apps called IntelliCare, really targeted apps that are, again, very evidence-based from a really good group. So I'll send that link. With ACT more specifically, Russ Harris has an ACT companion app that's, I think, about $16. It might be cheaper right now. And he also has a happiness trap online website. I have a website also called ACT Guide based on my research. And that one's $10 per user. It doesn't go to me or anything. It just goes through the university and hopefully just gets enough users. Well, it does already, but we have about 1,200 users who signed up, but it is just to fund the ongoing licensing so we can like keep it running, the hosting costs, and then for a graduate student to kind of keep it running and improve it. So that's another one. And there's some other mindfulness apps. I have a few I like a lot, like Stop, Breathe, and Think. Yep. So I can send over maybe a quick list like that. But that's to say there's a lot out there. But really I recommend using good evidence-based examples like the list I'll send, because there's some unhelpful stuff. Books is another Wild West, but there is a good list that I'll send. It's from a group of psychologists in the U.S. where they actually specifically vet the books. So they only have books that they say, okay, this is good evidence-based. So I'll send that as well. You have to kind of navigate it a little bit, but it's sortable by problem, I think. So you can kind of find what you're looking for.
That's wonderful. I appreciated that disclaimer too, because there are so many helpful resources, and ones that could be that we just haven't studied. Mm-hmm. And I think about that. That's probably what keeps me awake at night for my own Life After Pornography program. That, I've worked a lot with ACT and with pornography and have success individually. And so I put together that program based on those principles, but I haven't done research on it. Like, I can't say like, oh, here's the outcomes. Like, I haven't done that research. So I hope that it's helpful, but we don't know. And I think that's what the value of doing research on these programs really is.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you're making a nice point that when things haven't been researched, they're like we say they're kind of like unverified. You can't say if they're effective or not. We don't know, but there's a huge distinction between unverified that's like we kind of know like it's pretty much using what we've tested and we think is effective versus like, oh, this is a totally different approach that's never been tested before, or one we even know is unhelpful, which there are self-help things out there. So like I think your website would be a good example where we know the skills are useful. So sure, the exact website hasn't been tested, but we have enough research to suggest it's likely to be helpful. But yeah, we haven't tested that one in particular. But one thing I'd recommend, part of why I wanted to bring that up is that I especially recommend people look for some certain names that we know that it's based on and using content that we know is helpful, even if that specific thing hasn't been tested. And that would be cognitive behavioral therapy, ACT. In my opinion, mindfulness, although there it can be used in a lot of ways. So just be mindful that mindfulness can mean a lot, but in general, we know that's helpful. Dialectical behavior therapy, behavioral activation. But really, I think like if it usually it'll say like CBT or ACT or mindfulness, that's like probably a pretty good set to steer you in a good direction. And so then at least it's like it's based on the things we know are helpful, as opposed to if not, you don't really know what you're getting. And again, there are well-documented examples of things that sound really reasonable that end up being harmful to people.
Yeah.
So there are things out there that could be not helpful to you or even harmful. And I don't mean to say that in an alarmist way, but just to be mindful as a consumer, you don't quite know what you're getting if it hasn't been studied.
Yep, I appreciate that, because those are treatments you mentioned, they've been around for a long time and they've been found helpful with so many different presenting concerns. The literature there is quite substantial, so those are helpful things to look for.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe one last question I have while I got you here. So you're kind of aware of the ACT research on pornography. What are some of the treatment outcomes that we know as far as ACT as a treatment for pornography?
Yes. So, this is actually a good example of what we've been discussing. If you think of like the FDA model, right? And like we're all like keenly aware of the FDA model as we're looking for hopefully some, vaccines and things like that. There's a difference between like proof of concept research and then like really well established. I'd say we're more on the proof of concept side, but I'll kind of talk through why I think that's actually pretty reasonable and okay. So basically, ACT has been tested broadly a lot for a lot of different problems. We know it's broadly helpful. But then we really want to know, okay, is it helpful for this problem? And they're following the FDA model as an example. We have some areas where we can say, gosh, we've done some really well-controlled studies, enough of them from independent labs that like, if this was FDA regulated, which it isn't, but if it was, like, it would be FDA approved. It'd be like, okay, like this makes sense. ACT is helpful for chronic pain. It's helpful for depression, et cetera. And then there's some areas where it's like we have really nice promising evidence. And so in pornography use, I put in that category where particularly Mike Tuig, he's done a multiple baseline study. Essentially, it's like if you did treat therapy for like 5 people, but you did really careful measurement and then some other design features that make us a little more certain that it was the treatment that helped them. That seemed useful for bringing down pornography use. And then with his student, Jesse Crosby, they did a randomized controlled trial. And again, showing nice data that relative to not getting treatment, this helped to reduce pornography-related problems. So there's some good preliminary data. But we can again generalize from the broader literature to say it's definitely not going to be harmful. I don't have any reason to think it would be, which is always the first thing I think of if something's been researched. And then it certainly seems like it'd be helpful for a lot of different issues. And there's some good preliminary evidence to suggest it's useful for pornography. So there's not a lot of treatments that have received careful research. So I believe from my review of the literatures that I've done that ACT is actually one of the stronger researched areas. So it's kind of interesting. It's an unfortunate problem. There hasn't been more research in the area. So that weighs in, like if you were like a governing body and thinking like, what do we use? It's like, that's actually one of the better research treatments to date. So it's not a slam dunk. We know for sure this has been the best validated thing ever, but we'd say there's some good data to suggest it's useful there.
And you missed yours, the one that you published that I came across, where you just had people read that general ACT self-help book, get out of your mind and into your life. And that was helpful.
Yes, and thanks for reminding me. So we've also been doing some preliminary research looking at the self-guided format. So Get Out of Your Mind Into Your Life is a general act book. It was the first self-help book written by Steve Hayes back in 2005. But it's nice because it just covers acts generally. And yeah, it showed some nice initial evidence to suggest just reading the book could help people improve their quality of life and pornography concerns. So thank you for reminding me. So yeah, so again, some nice preliminary evidence there. Um, and in terms of books, so Get Out of Your Mind Into Your Life, that's a good general act book. I'll maybe send, if it's okay, I'll send you a few other ones that are more recent also, just so people have some examples of here's some good act books. And we've been testing more and finding they're generally effective, which makes sense because the skills are kind of the same. It's just how people write about them. So this maybe gives some evidence to suggest even learning these general skills could help with this target problem. I think where I would encourage people to think about is you're learning general skills and what you're missing is a therapist or a book telling you how to apply it to this specific problem. So just being mindful of thinking like, okay, I learned this cool thing. How does that apply to what I'm dealing with? And kind of taking that step.
That's why I felt hopeful reading that study where if a general act book helped people reduce porn, hopefully a specific program, hopefully it would be even more effective as it's tailored to that. But I like what you said about the state of the research, that ACT is well supported. And yet as far as treatments for pornography, there's not many. I think I found one CBT study for pornography and then 3 ACT studies on porn, but I've never found any treatment outcome studies for addiction programs or any other approach. So there's so many treatment programs out there for pornography, and they're not studied. They're not well researched, and ACT is probably leading the way, and yet it's still really early. There's not dozens and dozens of studies. Like I found like 3, but those 3 studies were really solid and impressive. But it's not like other areas where we have hundreds of treatment outcome studies for it. It feels really early to me.
Yeah. And then kind of with that in mind as a consumer, and maybe this feels like a leading way to frame it, but I don't mean to. I actually mean it as an honest question. It's like you've got 8 meds in front of you, and like you're like, these 6 haven't been studied. This one has a little research. That one has a little more, and they seem promising. And there's a lot of reasons you choose whatever. And again, there's a lot of patient preference. These meds have different side effects. They mean different things, etc. But like, we're not talking about the research just for its own sake. It's like consumers being informed, knowing what you're getting, and if it's harmful, which some things can be harmful, and then if it's actually helpful. And so at least there's some good preliminary evidence on a few of these, CBT and ACT.
Yeah, and I love that. So the last thing I wanted to ask you, and this will be my last question, hopefully. So you just took over as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Contextual and Behavioral Science.
Yeah.
How's that going?
Nice and busy. It's been really fun and interesting and learning a lot. What do I want to say about that? So this is the journal that is the flagship journal for our broader organization, Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. And this organization is like the intellectual home for ACT, as ACT being part of this contextual behavioral science tradition, this other way of approaching how we study human behavior and how to improve people's lives. It includes a lot of other things too, other treatment approaches, other traditions in terms of just understanding behavior, basic research, evolutionary science, and so on. So it's kind of like a broader group. And so it's been really interesting helping kind of grow those different areas of the community. Well, one of the interesting things too is in the context of the pandemic. So we're looking at like, how can we be helpful there? Which is something that just keeps coming back to me. Like I'm excited to talk today about self-help resources because it's like, okay, we have these things. How do we get it to people? And we're looking somewhere like the journal, like, okay, how can we help get stuff out to people in a role as a journal? So that's been a lot of fun, although challenging.
Oh, your screen froze. Are you still with me?
Oh, yes.
Here we go.
Sorry, I'm not sure what point it cut out at.
You said it's been really fun to think about how to get these resources to people during the pandemic.
Yes, yes. And actually, that's pretty much the last point. It's just,
Oh, okay.
it's been interesting and challenging, but I think we've got some nice solutions working with some of our associate editors.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I love the
Um,
website, the ACBS website. They've got a nice tool on there where you can search for ACT therapists across the country, but I believe across the world, right? So that's a great way to, if you're
yes,
interested in working with someone with ACT, great resource for them.
yes, and that's a great point. So that find a therapist format is really useful, and I believe many therapists, actually, I know, so many therapists at this point are using telehealth. So even if you're in a point in a pandemic or otherwise where you're not able to see people in person, there are those options.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Mike, for taking some time to share your experiences and wisdom. I appreciate you so much, Mike.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. That was fun.